Harold Voss didn't knock. He never knocked. He pushed open the door to Eliza Whitmore's small shop on Juniper Street like he owned it, because in his mind, he already did. He dropped a folded paper on her cutting table without looking at her, without greeting her daughter sitting in the corner with a rag doll, without so much as removing his hat. "You're 2 weeks behind on the lease," he said. "Pay by Friday or I start looking for a new tenant." Eliza looked up from her stitching. "The lease says end of month, Mr. Voss." He smiled. That flat, unhurried smile that never reached his eyes. "My copy says Friday." He tapped the paper once with 2 fingers, turned, and walked out the same way he came in. Maisie watched the door close and then looked at her mother. Eliza's hands had stopped moving. If you've ever watched someone hold themselves together when everything inside them is about to break, subscribe to this channel right now, because that's exactly the kind of story we tell here. Stories about ordinary people who refuse to stay down. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story has traveled. And don't go anywhere, because what happens next between this woman, her little girl, and a quiet rancher named Caleb Thornridge is going to stay with you long after it's over. The paper Harold Voss left behind wasn't a lease notice. Eliza figured that out in about 30 seconds. It was a letter of intent, a document drawn up by someone named Aldrich Property Holdings, stating that the building at 14 Juniper Street was under review for acquisition and that current occupants should plan accordingly. There was no signature she recognized, just a date, just Friday. She set it face down on the table so Maisie wouldn't ask about it. Her daughter was 4 years old and already too good at reading her mother's silences. "Is that man coming back?" Maisie asked. She hadn't moved from the corner, but she had put down the rag doll. "No," Eliza said. Then more carefully, "I don't think so." "He didn't say hello?" "No, he didn't. Papa always said hello." Eliza picked up her needle again. "I know he did, baby." She pushed the thread through the fabric and pulled it tight, and she told herself the same thing she'd been telling herself for 2 years. That she was fine, that the shop was fine, that the life she had built on this street in this town was solid enough to hold. She told herself that until her hands stopped shaking. It took a while. Alder Creek in the autumn of 1883 was the kind of town that looked better from a distance. From the ridge coming in on the northern road, it had the shape of something permanent. A church steeple, a row of false-fronted buildings, smoke rising from chimneys in the gray morning light. Up close, it smelled like mud and livestock and the particular exhaustion of people who had been working hard for years without getting much further ahead. Eliza had arrived in Alder Creek with her husband Thomas 3 years ago, young and full of plans. Thomas had wanted to try ranching. Hy had been a tailor's apprentice back east, but something in him had needed open land, needed the feeling of distance that you couldn't get between city buildings. Eliza had followed him because she loved him, and because she was 24 and believed in the same things he did. The first winter killed the cattle. The second winter killed Thomas. Not dramatically, not with any violence. He had gone out in a blizzard to check on a neighbor's fence line, and the temperature had dropped faster than anyone expected, and he had not come home. They found him 2 days later. He looked, the men told her afterward, like he was sleeping. Eliza had buried him in the frozen ground and then gone back inside her house and sat at the kitchen table for 6 hours without moving. Maisie had been 2 years old, asleep in the next room, unaware that the world had changed. At some point that evening, Eliza had gotten up, heated water for coffee, and started making a list. That was the thing people in Alder Creek never quite understood about her. They expected grief to hollow a person out, and it did. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But grief had also made her ruthlessly practical in a way she hadn't been before. When there's nothing left to lose, you get very clear about what you actually need. She needed income. She had a sewing machine, a good one of the things Thomas had insisted on bringing because he'd grown up around fine fabric and knew quality when he saw it. She had skill. Her mother had taught her, and Thomas's father had taught her more, and she had spent 3 years quietly improving in the evenings while Thomas planned his ranching future. She rented the space on Juniper Street from a man named Wallace Ostroff, who had been fair-minded and even-tempered and had died 8 months ago of a heart condition nobody knew he had. His estate had sold the building to Harold Voss, and everything had been different since. Voss wasn't from Alder Creek. He was from somewhere east of here, some city where men like him moved money around and called it work. He had bought 3 buildings on Juniper Street in the past year alone. He raised rents without explanation, enforced deadlines that didn't exist in the original agreements, and smiled that flat smile whenever someone pointed out the discrepancy. Eliza had been fighting him through polite letters and polite conversations for 6 months. She was running out of polite. She finished the seam she was working on, clipped the thread, and set the dress aside. Outside, the afternoon light was going flat and gray. Maisie had fallen asleep in the corner chair, the rag doll tucked under her chin, her breathing slow and even. Eliza covered her with a wool blanket and stood there for a moment looking at her daughter's face. The child had Thomas's jaw, his particular stubbornness around the mouth. She was going to be difficult in the best possible way, and Eliza intended to make sure she had the room to be. She picked up Voss's paper again and read it through twice more. Then she folded it, tucked it in her apron pocket, and started closing up the shop. She had a dinner to think about. The invitation had come 10 days ago, delivered not by note but in person, which was the kind of thing that made it harder to refuse. Caleb Thornridge had stopped in to pick up a mended shirt. He was not a regular customer, but he came in occasionally when something needed work he couldn't do himself. And on his way out, he had paused at the door and turned back with the expression of a man who had clearly been arguing with himself for some time. "I was wondering," he said, "if you might want to have dinner with me. Sometime. If you were interested." He said it the way a person says something they've practiced saying and then forgotten the practice of at the crucial moment. Eliza had looked at him for a beat. She knew who Caleb Thornridge was. Everyone in Alder Creek knew everyone, but she didn't know him well. He was quiet. He kept to himself. He ran a spread about 4 miles east of town that had been mostly destroyed in the same brutal winter that had taken Thomas, and he had been rebuilding it ever since. He had a reputation for reliability, for showing up when neighbors needed help with fencing or hauling, for not talking more than necessary. He was also, she had noticed without particularly meaning to, a man who listened when someone spoke to him. Actually listened, not just waited for his turn. "Dinner," she said. "Yes." "Just dinner?" He looked slightly uncomfortable. "I'd like to get to know you better, Mrs. Whitmore. That's all I mean by it." She had said she'd think about it. She had thought about it for 10 days, gone back and forth, decided yes, and then no, and then yes again. She'd made arrangements with Mrs. Paulson down the street to watch Maisie for the evening. And then that morning, 2 hours before she was due to be at Caleb Thornridge's place for dinner, Mrs. Paulson had sent her grandson around with a note. "Awful sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. Come down with something terrible. Can't take the girl tonight." Eliza had stood in her shop holding that note for a solid minute. Then Maisie had looked up from her rag doll and said, "What's wrong, Mama?" "Nothing," Eliza said. "Go get your coat." She almost sent a note of her own. She had the pen in her hand, the paper ready, the perfectly reasonable excuse all formed. Something came up. Another time. But she didn't send it. She wasn't entirely sure why. Something stubborn in her. Maybe. Or something that recognized that she had been using reasonable excuses to avoid things for 2 years, and she was getting tired of her own avoidance. So she bundled Maisie into her coat and her good hat, and she walked across town in the cooling evening air with her 4-year-old daughter on her hip, and she told herself the whole way that this was going to be a disaster. She was almost certainly right. Caleb Thornridge's house was not what she'd expected. She'd assumed ranch and thought spare. Functional furniture, nothing unnecessary. The kind of place that showed a man's priorities were outside, not in. And the outside matched that assumption. The barn was solid, the fencing recent, the yard kept without being fussed over. But inside there were books. Not a decorative shelf, not a few volumes arranged for appearance. Actual books, red books, spines cracked and pages worn, stacked on shelves and on the mantelpiece and in 2 piles beside the armchair near the window. There was a rug on the floor that had some color left in it. There was a lamp in the corner that was positioned exactly where you'd want it if you were going to sit and read. She took all of this in the moment he opened the door. He took in Maisie. There was a pause. One of those pauses that has too many things happening inside it to look like nothing. "I'm sorry," Eliza said. The words came out fast, the practiced apology she'd been preparing the whole walk over. "My arrangement fell through. I should have sent word ahead. I completely understand if—" Caleb stepped back from the door. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he turned, walked across the room, picked up the extra chair that was pushed against the wall beneath the window and carried it to the table. He set it beside one of the 2 chairs already positioned there. He looked at Maisie. "You like chicken?" he asked. Maisie stared at him with the evaluating severity that only small children can sustain. She looked at his hat, a large battered thing that was slightly too big for the indoor space. She looked at the books. She looked at the lamp. Then she looked back at him. "Is it the stringy kind?" she said. "I don't like the stringy kind. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. It wasn't quite a smile yet. It was the thing that happens just before a smile when a person is trying not to show one. "Not stringy," he said. "Okay," said Maisie, and she walked inside like she'd been invited. Eliza stood in the doorway for another second, something unnamed moving through her chest, and then she followed her daughter inside. The chicken was not stringy. It was, in fact, very good. Braised with onion and sage, served with roasted root vegetables and bread that Caleb admitted, when pressed, he had traded 2 hours of fence work to get from the baker on Main Street. "You don't bake?" Eliza said. "I can make biscuits. That's the limit of it." "Papa made biscuits," Maisie said. She said it matter-of-factly, the way children state things that adults tiptoe around. "Did he?" Caleb said. Not a question, not a pivot away, just an acknowledgement. "They were flat," Maisie said. "Mama said his biscuits were a character flaw." Eliza closed her eyes briefly. "She might have said that," she said. "Once. She says it was a joke," Maisie added helpfully. "But she said it a lot." Caleb looked at Eliza with an expression that was definitely a smile now, contained but real, and she felt her face do something against her will. "Thomas wasn't much for baking," she said. "He had other strengths." "What were his strengths?" Caleb asked. It was a direct question. People didn't usually ask direct questions about Thomas. They stepped around him, used careful phrasing, made space without occupying it. Caleb Thornridge asked like he actually wanted to know. "He was kind," Eliza said after a moment. "Genuinely kind. Not in the performing for an audience way, just... He paid attention to people, noticed things. If you were having a hard day, he'd know before you said anything." Caleb nodded. "He sounds like someone worth missing," he said. Eliza looked at her plate. "Yes," she said. "He was." There was a pause, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. It was the kind that settles between people when something honest has been said and neither of them wants to rush past it. Maisie filled it by asking Caleb why his hat was so big. "It belonged to my father," he said. "Was your father big?" "Medium, I'd say. He just liked room." "I like room too," Maisie said. She had finished her chicken and was now investigating the bread with the focused attention of someone conducting research. "Mama says I take up too much room when I sleep." "She sprawls," Eliza confirmed. "I'm a big sleeper," Maisie said with dignity. Caleb looked at the child across the table with an expression Eliza couldn't quite name. Not sentimental, nothing overplayed. More like he was noticing something and deciding it was worth noticing. "Fair enough," he said. After dinner, Maisie lasted about 20 minutes before she fell asleep on the chair in the corner. The same corner chair, Eliza noticed, that was positioned near the lamp, near the books, near the warmest part of the room. Caleb had put a folded wool blanket over the arm of the chair without being asked, without calling attention to it. Maisie had climbed up, tucked herself in, and gone out like a candle. Eliza watched her sleep and felt something complicated and quiet. "She does that everywhere," she said. "Falls asleep wherever she lands." "Good quality," Caleb said. He was clearing the table, moving carefully so as not to make noise, and Eliza stood up to help. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, and picked up the plates. They worked around each other in the kitchen without getting in each other's way, which was either a lucky accident or said something about both of them. The dishes were simple. The kitchen was clean. Outside, the wind had come up and they could hear it moving against the shutters. "How is the shop doing?" Caleb asked. It wasn't quite small talk. He asked it the same way he'd asked about Thomas, like he was prepared for a real answer. Eliza considered giving him the polished version. Fine, busy, managing. The words were right there. "Harold Voss left a letter today," she said instead, "telling me the building's under some kind of acquisition review. He wants money by Friday that the lease doesn't say I owe." Caleb was quiet for a moment, drying a plate with methodical care. "Voss has been doing that to 3 or 4 people on that street," he said. "Ran the milliner out last month that way." "I know. You talked to anyone? Lawyer? Anyone?" "The lawyer in town is the same one Voss uses for his property dealings." Caleb set the plate down. "That's the problem. I'm aware." He looked at her. "What are you going to do?" No one had asked her that either. They asked what she was going to do about Maisie, about the shop, about managing a loan. They didn't usually ask what she was going to do in the sense of trusting that she had an answer. "I have some ideas," she said carefully. "There's a lawyer in Crayston about 18 miles out. I wrote to him last week, and there are a few other tenants on Juniper Street in the same situation. If we organize..." "That's smart," Caleb said. "Just that. Not have you thought about, not the problem with that is not let me suggest. Just, that's smart." Eliza felt something shift slightly, like a weight she'd been carrying had moved to a different part of her shoulder. "It might not work," she said. "Might not," he agreed, "but it's still smart." They finished the dishes. The wind was still going outside. Maisie hadn't moved in the corner chair. Eliza leaned against the kitchen doorframe and looked at her daughter sleeping, and she thought about Thomas, and she thought about the letter from Voss, and she thought about the strange particular comfort of an evening she had expected to be terrible that had turned out to be something else entirely. Something she didn't have a good word for yet. "Why did you invite me to dinner?" she asked. The real reason. Caleb had hung up the dish towel and was standing on the other side of the kitchen, not crowding her space. He thought about the question for a real moment, not performing thought, actually thinking. "Because I've watched you run that shop for 2 years, he said, "and you never ask anyone for anything, and you work harder than most men I know, and you laugh at Maisie's jokes even when they're not funny yet because you want her to know they're worth making." He paused. "And because I haven't eaten dinner with someone worth talking to in a long time." Eliza looked at him. "That's several reasons," she said. "I know." "You said the real reason, singular." "I know," he said again, and then quieter. "I like you, Eliza. That's the short version." She looked away first. She looked at the window and the dark outside it and the lamp reflected in the glass. And she felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in 2 years, and she told herself it was too soon, too complicated, too uncertain. All of that was true. It was also true that she had walked across town with Maisie on her hip, expecting a disaster, and sat down to a dinner that wasn't one. "I should get her home," she said. "She'll sleep through being carried, but she'll be stiff in the morning if she stays in that chair." "I'll walk you," Caleb said. "You don't have to." "I know." He got his coat. He got Maisie's coat too and held it open so Eliza could ease it around the sleeping child without waking her. They managed it, barely, one of Maisie's arms going briefly the wrong way before Eliza got it sorted, with the kind of clumsy cooperation that happens when two people are trying to do something carefully together for the first time. Maisie half woke when Eliza lifted her, said something incoherent about the stringy chicken, and went back to sleep with her face against her mother's shoulder. Outside, the air was cold and the street was empty. Caleb walked on Eliza's left side, and they went at the pace that Maisie's weight required, which was slower than either of them would have walked alone. The wind had died down. The town was quiet in the particular way of frontier towns at night, when the noise of the day had stopped and the dark came right to the edge of the lampposts. "She asked me about the hat," Caleb said, low enough not to disturb the sleeping child. "She asks everyone about everything." "I don't mind it." "I know," Eliza said, and then realized she'd used his phrasing, and he noticed it too because there was a small silence that felt like something passed between them. They came to the front of her house on Juniper Street. She had left a lamp burning in the window. She always did when she went out, so the dark wouldn't be waiting for her when she came back. It was one of those habits she'd developed after Thomas, small and deliberate, the kind of thing nobody knew about. She shifted Maisie against her shoulder and found her key. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "The chicken was genuinely good. The bread was someone else's contribution. I noticed. Give my regards to the fence." That earned her an actual smile, full and real, and she hadn't quite expected it to look the way it did on him. It changed his face considerably. She looked away. "Good night, Caleb." "Good night, Eliza." She got the key in the lock, got the door open, got Maisie inside without waking her. She settled her daughter on the small bed in the back room and sat on the edge of it in the dark, listening to her breathe. Then she went back to the kitchen, sat down at the table, and took Harold Voss's letter out of her pocket. She unfolded it and read it through one more time. Then she picked up her pen and a fresh piece of paper and wrote a letter to the lawyer in Crayston. Detailed this time. Specific. She included everything she knew about Voss's tactics, the names of the other tenants she'd spoken to, the dates of each discrepancy she'd documented over the past 6 months. She wrote it clearly and without apology, and she signed her name at the bottom with the full weight of it. She sealed the envelope and set it by the door to post in the morning. Then she sat back in her kitchen chair and thought about a man who had, without being asked, brought over a third chair and set it at the table, who had asked about Thomas like Thomas was worth knowing about, who had said that's smart and meant it like a plain fact. She thought about how dangerous that kind of thing was after 2 years of carrying everything alone. She thought about it for a long time. Outside, the wind came up again and moved through the eaves of the house on Juniper Street, and Eliza Whitmore sat at her kitchen table and let herself think, for the first time in a long time, about what wanting something for herself might cost her, and whether, this time, it might actually be worth it. The envelope sat by the door. Maisie breathed steadily in the back room. The lamp burned low, and somewhere 4 miles east of town, a quiet rancher sat in his reading chair with a book open in his lap and didn't read a single word of it. The letter to the lawyer in Crayston came back in 6 days. Eliza had expected something cautious. A list of caveats, a schedule of fees, a polite explanation of why her situation was complicated. What she got instead was 2 pages in a precise, economical hand from a man named Garrett Foss, who said he had been watching Aldrich Property Holdings for the better part of a year and that her documentation was, in his words, exactly the kind of material that turns a suspicion into a case. He wanted to meet. He could be in Alder Creek the following Thursday if she could arrange for the other affected tenants to be present. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table before Maisie woke up. Then she read it a 3rd time, slowly, making sure she hadn't misunderstood anything. She hadn't. She folded it back into the envelope and started making a list of names. There were 7 businesses on Juniper Street. Of those, 4 were dealing with some version of what Voss had done to her. Irregular demands, manufactured deadlines, paperwork that didn't match original agreements. She knew this because she had spent the past 2 weeks doing what she always did when she needed information. She had listened. At the dry goods counter, at the well, at the back table of the lunchroom where the women who ran the smaller shops sometimes sat together over coffee. People talked when they felt heard, and Eliza had the kind of face that made people feel heard without trying very hard. She went to see Margaret Hollis first because Margaret ran the alteration shop 2 doors down and had the sharpest memory of anyone Eliza knew. Margaret was 61, had been in Alder Creek since it was still called something else, and had a way of saying difficult things in a flat, declarative tone that made them impossible to argue with. Thursday, Eliza said, and explained the rest of it. Margaret looked at her for a moment. "This lawyer," she said, "he's legitimate? His letter is. Letters can be anything. I know. Come Thursday and see for yourself." Margaret picked up her scissors, thought about it, and set them back down. "Who else are you asking?" "Ned Coulter at the print shop, the Huang family at the laundry, and Dora Satterley. Dora won't want to get involved. She's scared of Voss." "I know," Eliza said. "I'm going to ask her anyway." Margaret picked up her scissors again, which was apparently how she indicated agreement because she didn't say no. And the next morning she was at Eliza's door at 7 with a folder of her own documents organized by date with notes in the margins. Ned Coulter said yes immediately and with a kind of compressed fury that told Eliza he'd been waiting for someone to ask. The Huang family asked twice if it was safe and then said yes, because the alternative was watching their lease get devoured piece by piece. Dora Satterley said no, then sent her teenage son around the next evening with a message saying she had changed her mind but didn't want anyone to know she was coming, which Eliza respected without comment. Thursday came. Garrett Foss was not what Eliza had pictured from his letter. She had pictured someone neat and composed. What arrived was a lean, sun-worn man in his late 40s who walked with a slight hitch in his left leg and carried a leather case that had been repaired in 3 places. He had sharp eyes and a way of looking at a room that reminded her of someone checking a door for weaknesses before going through it. He shook her hand like he was meeting a business partner. "The documentation you sent was thorough," he said. "That's not common." "I kept records," Eliza said. "I keep records of everything. Good habit." He looked around at the assembled group. Margaret with her folder, Ned Coulter with his jaw set, the Huang family quiet and watchful, and Dora Satterley sitting in the chair closest to the door. Let's get to it. He laid out what he knew about Aldrich Property Holdings in the plain, unhurried way of someone who had assembled a case piece by piece and knew exactly where each piece sat. The company was registered in another county, controlled by 3 investors, one of whom was Harold Voss in a capacity that his public dealings in Alder Creek were designed to obscure. The acquisition strategy was consistent. Buy buildings cheap through estate sales or distressed sellers, install a local face, Voss in this case, to manage tenants and manufacture cause to break leases or push people out, then flip the cleared properties to larger commercial interests at a significant profit. "It's fraud," Margaret said. "It's close to fraud," Voss said. "The line between aggressive property management and fraud is a narrow one in this territory, and they've been walking it carefully. What I need is documentation showing the demands made don't match the lease agreements, dates, amounts, discrepancies. I need multiple tenants willing to make a formal statement, and I need time, because the county recorder's office in Millhaven has records going back to the original sale of these properties, and I intend to go through every one of them." "How long?" Ned Coulter asked. "A month, maybe 6 weeks. I have until Friday," Eliza said. Foss looked at her, I'm aware, which is why you're going to need to stall. How? Send Voss a letter. Tell him you're reviewing the documentation with your legal representative and require an extension in accordance with the dispute resolution clause in your original lease. Eliza blinked. There is a dispute resolution clause? There is in the original Ostroff lease agreements. Standard language from that period. Voss either doesn't know it's there or assumed none of you had read carefully enough to know it was. He looked at her steadily. Had you? No, she admitted. Now you have. Use it. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, everyone in the room had agreed to make formal statements except Dora Satterley, who said she needed another week. Voss accepted this without pressure, which went some distance toward Eliza trusting him. After the others left, Voss stayed long enough to drink a cup of coffee and review her documents one more time. He flagged 4 items she hadn't considered significant and told her why they were. He did it efficiently, without condescension, treating her like someone capable of understanding complex things quickly, which she was. You've built something here, he said, looking around the shop before he left. I'm trying to keep it, she said. That's usually the harder job. He picked up his repaired case. I'll be in touch within the week. He left. Eliza stood in her empty shop and listened to Maisie playing in the back room, stacking wooden blocks and narrating something complicated about a princess who lived in a fort. The late afternoon light came through the front window at a low angle and made the dust motes visible in the air. She wrote the letter to Voss that evening. She kept it exact, formal, and entirely free of the anger she felt. She cited the clause Voss had told her about by section and line number. She signed it and sealed it and posted it the next morning. Voss's response arrived 4 days later. It was 2 lines. He acknowledged the dispute clause invocation and stated that he would be in contact with his own legal representation. It was, Eliza understood, the first time she had made him move instead of the other way around. She allowed herself exactly 1 minute of satisfaction before she went back to work. The week after the meeting, Caleb came by the shop. She had seen him twice since the dinner. Once in passing on Main Street, a brief exchange about nothing in particular, and once when he'd brought in a pair of work trousers that needed the knees relined. Both times had been ordinary. Both times she had been aware of him in a way she didn't fully want to examine. This time he came in the late morning when the shop was quiet. Maisie was in the back with a length of muslin and a pair of child's scissors, cutting shapes she called patterns. The bell above the door rang, and Eliza looked up from the jacket she was fitting on the dress form and saw Caleb in the doorway, hat in hand. I heard about the lawyer meeting, he said, from Ned Coulter. Ned talks. He does. Caleb stayed by the door. He didn't come all the way in uninvited, she noticed. He stood in the space between in and out, which struck her as characteristic. I wanted to ask how it went. Better than I expected, she said. It may amount to something. Good. He turned his hat in his hands once. I also wanted to say, I know someone who ranches near Millhaven. He knows most of the county officials out there. If Voss runs into obstruction at the records office, it might help to have someone who knows which clerk is reasonable and which ones need a different kind of asking. Eliza set down her pins. You're offering a connection. I'm offering the name, he said. What Voss does with it is his business. She looked at him. He was not pushing. He was not arranging things without her. He was standing in the doorway holding his hat and offering a name, the way you'd hand someone a tool they could choose to use or set aside. Write it down, she said. I'll pass it to Voss. He wrote the name and the ranch location on a piece of paper she gave him, using the pen she kept on the counter. His handwriting was better than she expected, clear and deliberate, the letters not crowded. Thank you, she said. Sure. He folded his hands around his hat again. From the back room, Maisie's voice rose briefly, apparently in conversation with her muslin shapes. Caleb glanced toward the sound. She's cutting patterns, Eliza said. Does she know how? No, she's very confident about it. Something in his face moved. That's a good quality. It's maddening, Eliza said. It's also probably a good quality. He smiled. The real one. The one that came slow and changed his whole face. And she looked back at her jacket. I'll let Voss know about your contact, she said. Okay. He put his hat back on. Good luck with it, Eliza. He went out. The bell rang. Eliza looked at the piece of paper with the name and the location written on it in clear, deliberate letters, and she held it for a moment before she set it beside her pincushion. From the back room, Maisie announced that she had cut a very important shape and needed someone to look at it. Eliza went to look at it. The shape was irregular in ways that defied any particular interpretation. She said it was excellent, and she meant it in the way you can mean something even when it's not quite true, which is a kind of kindness rather than a lie. The weeks that followed were not easy. Easy would have been the wrong word. They were busy in a way that had layers to it. The regular work of the shop, which was the one reliable thing, the ongoing correspondence with Garrett Foss, who sent short, precise letters with specific requests for additional documentation, and the quieter work of watching Maisie and making sure that the instability Eliza felt didn't show in a way the child would absorb. Children absorb everything. Eliza knew this. Maisie was not unsettled, which meant Eliza was doing something right, though she couldn't always identify what. Caleb came by twice more in those weeks. Once to pick up the relined trousers, and once, this one she hadn't expected, to bring a jar of apple preserves that his neighbor had sent with him on some errand, and that he claimed he'd been given too many of. She accepted them with a level expression, and he left without making more of it than it was, which she appreciated. The preserves were very good. She didn't tell him that, but she thought she probably would at some point. Maisie, who had been present for both visits, had updated her assessment of Caleb Thornridge from the man with the big hat to the man with the big hat who doesn't ask dumb questions. This was, Eliza gathered, high praise. "What's a dumb question?" Eliza asked her the evening after the preserves. "When people ask if I miss Papa," Maisie said, matter-of-factly, eating bread with some of the preserves on it. "I always miss Papa. Asking about it doesn't change anything." Eliza watched her daughter's face. "Does it bother you when people ask?" "It makes them feel better," Maisie said. "I don't think it's for me." She said it with the easy certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to soften the things she understood. Eliza looked at her for a long moment, and then she reached over and straightened the collar of her daughter's dress, which didn't need straightening. "You're pretty perceptive for 4, she said. "Almost 5, Maisie corrected. "Almost 5, Eliza agreed. The meeting with Foss at the beginning of his 6th week in Crayston produced the first real evidence. He sent word ahead by telegram, then came himself 2 days later. The county records showed a pattern of title transfers connected to Aldrich property holdings that had been obscured through a series of intermediary sales. One of those sales involved a property on Juniper Street that Wallace Ostroff had not in fact agreed to sell before his death. The signature on the transfer document did not match the samples available in his other recorded paperwork, and one of the witnesses listed on the document had been dead for 3 years at the time of signing. "That's forgery," Eliza said. "That's what I believe a judge will call it," Foss said. "We're not there yet. I need another 2 weeks and access to Ostroff's estate records, if his executor will cooperate." "His executor is his sister in Laramie," Eliza said. "Her name is Ruth Partridge. She came through here after the funeral. She was furious about the sale, said she never authorized it and didn't know about it until after it was done." Foss looked at her steadily. "How do you know that?" "Because I brought her a meal when she was in town settling the estate," Eliza said, "and she talked for 2 hours and I listened." A brief pause. "Do you have any way to reach her?" "I have an address. She gave it to me." Something shifted in Foss's professional composure. Not much, but she caught it. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "your listening habits may be the single most valuable thing in this case." She wrote the letter to Ruth Partridge that afternoon. What happened next took 3 weeks, not 2, and it was not clean or linear. Ruth Partridge wrote back promptly and with considerable force, confirming that she had never authorized the sale of her brother's building, had in fact contacted the county office at the time and been told the paperwork was in order, which she had not believed but had been unable to disprove. She had the original correspondence. She had kept everything. Foss went to Laramie. In his absence, Foss made his next move. He didn't come to the shop himself this time. He sent a man Eliza didn't recognize. Younger, well-dressed, with the particular smoothness of someone paid to deliver unpleasant things politely. The man arrived on a Wednesday morning and presented her with a new document, which he described as a revised lease agreement that superseded the original Ostroff terms. Eliza looked at it. Then she looked at him. "I haven't agreed to new terms," she said. "The transfer of ownership allows the new owner The transfer of ownership," she said, "is currently under legal review, which Mr. Voss is aware of because I told him so in writing and because he acknowledged it." She held up the document. "I'm keeping this." She set it on the counter. "And I'm writing to my legal representative today. You can tell Mr. Voss that." The man blinked. He had clearly expected more resistance in a different shape. Tears maybe, or confusion, or someone who didn't know what she was entitled to say. He gathered himself. "Mrs. Whitmore, I understand this is... I know what it is. she said pleasantly. Good day. After he left, she stood at the counter for a moment and pressed her hands flat against the wood and breathed. Then she went to the back room where Maisie was eating an apple and pretending to read a catalog of seed varieties. Everything all right, Mama? Yes, Eliza said. Everything is fine. She sat down beside her daughter and picked up a piece of the apple Maisie hadn't gotten to yet. What are you planting? Carrots, Maisie said seriously, and possibly corn. I haven't decided about corn. Corn is complicated, Eliza agreed. She wrote to Foss that evening. She included the new document and described the encounter with precise accuracy. Then she sat back and thought about what Voss was trying to accomplish. He was escalating, which meant he knew he was running out of time. Escalation was its own kind of information. She passed what she'd worked out in a second note to Foss at the bottom of the same letter, labeling it clearly as her interpretation rather than fact. He wrote back 3 days later and said her interpretation was probably correct. It was around this time that Maisie decided Caleb Thornridge needed to see her patterns. Eliza hadn't planned for this. She hadn't planned for most of the things that had developed over the past weeks, but this particular development caught her sideways. Maisie had been collecting her irregular cut claw shapes in a paper envelope that she called her portfolio, and the next time Caleb stopped by the shop, this time to return the piece of paper with his contact's name, which Foss had apparently sent back with a note, Maisie came out of the back room carrying her portfolio and announced that she had something to show him. Caleb looked at Eliza briefly. She gave him a look that meant, I don't know either, just go with it. He crouched down to Maisie's level without being asked. This, Eliza had noticed, was something he did naturally. Not making a production of it, not treating it as a gesture, just adjusting to where someone was so he could actually talk to them. What have you got? He said. Maisie opened the envelope with great ceremony and removed 3 pieces of irregularly cut muslin. This one, she said, holding up the first, is a mountain. This one is a horse, and this one is a very complicated question. Caleb examined each piece with apparent seriousness. What's the question? Maisie thought about it. I haven't decided yet. That's why it's complicated. That makes sense, he said. He handed them back carefully. Maisie put them away and looked at him with the full-bore assessment she had been developing since the evening of the dinner. Do you have patterns? She asked. He considered this. I have the shape of the east fence line memorized, he said. Does that count? Maisie appeared to think it might. She went back to the other room. Caleb straightened up and looked at Eliza, who was looking at the middle distance with the particular expression of someone refusing to have a feeling in front of another person. She's something, he said. She is, Eliza agreed. Her voice was steady. Good. He set the return paper on the counter. Foss's contact came through, he said. The clerk at the records office had a better memory than they were letting on once someone with a local connection came asking. He told me, Eliza said. It made a difference. Caleb nodded. He started to say something, stopped, started again. I want to say something without it coming out wrong, and I'm not sure I can manage it. She looked at him. Try. I know you don't need anyone to manage things for you, he said. I'm not trying to step in front of what you're doing with Voss and the others. It cost me something. Watching Voss push people around on that street and offering a name was the only thing in my reach. I wasn't trying to take over. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, someone's cart went by on the street, loud and then gone. I know, she said. That's why I used it. Something in his face settled. Not relaxed. Settled. Like something that had been slightly displaced found its correct position. Okay, he said. Thank you, she said, for understanding the difference. He put his hat on. I'll let you get back to it. Caleb. He stopped. She was looking at the counter, not at him, arranging the return paper and her pincushion in a way that didn't need arranging. The preserves were very good, she said. A pause. She could feel him not moving. I'll tell her, he said. Tell her I'd like the variety if she ever puts it on a label. I'll do that. He went out. The bell rang. Eliza kept her eyes on the counter until she heard the bell stop. From the back room, Maisie said, I like him, Mama. Eliza took a breath. I know, baby, she said. She picked up her work and kept going because there was always more work and because keeping going was the thing she knew how to do better than almost anything else. Foss returned from Laramie with Ruth Partridge's signed and notarized statement, 3 pieces of correspondence that directly contradicted the ownership transfer documentation, and what he described as a viable path to formal fraud charges if the county prosecutor was willing to move. Whether the county prosecutor would be willing was a separate problem. Prosecutors were political animals, and Voss had money, which was its own kind of politics. It may not be enough to get him out of Alder Creek, Voss told her. What it may be enough to do is make the cost of staying higher than the profit. Eliza turned this over. He's in it for the money, she said. If the legal costs exceed what he'd make on the properties, he folds and moves somewhere easier, Voss said. That's the likely outcome. It's not justice in the storybook sense. I'm not interested in a storybook, Eliza said. I want my lease intact and my shop where it is. That's achievable, Voss said. Then that's what we work toward. He left the next morning for Millhaven, where he intended to present the fraud evidence to the county records office and request a formal review. He would be back in 2 weeks. Eliza went back to work. The morning after Voss left, she woke at 5, which was not unusual for her, and lay in the dark listening to Maisie breathe in the next room, and thought about Thomas. She did this sometimes. Not with grief, exactly. Not anymore. More with the particular fondness of something that belonged entirely to the past and had earned the right to stay there unchanged. She thought about his flat biscuits and his outsized plans and the way he had looked at her on good mornings like she was the most interesting thing in the room. She thought about how much of herself she had built in the 2 years since he was gone, and how that building had required her to become someone slightly different than she had been when she was building it with him. Not better or worse. Different. More load-bearing in certain ways, less trusting of easy things. She thought about Caleb Thornridge, who was not an easy thing. She got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with her account ledger and her correspondence folder and started planning the work week. The lamp made a warm circle on the table. Outside, the first gray light was beginning at the edge of the sky. She had a business to run. She had a case working through the county system. She had a daughter who needed breakfast and a daughter's portfolio that needed additional muslin. She had letters to write and seams to finish, and a winter order from the Hardcastle Ranch that was due by the end of the month. She thought, looking at the ledger and the lamp and the gray light at the window, quite a lot. It wasn't everything. She was not going to pretend it was everything, but it was enough to build from, and she had always been good at building. She turned to a fresh page in the ledger and started to write. The letter from Cheyenne arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of day that had no particular significance until something happened in it that made it one you remembered afterward. Eliza was hemming a wool skirt when Margaret Hollis came through the door without knocking, which was not like Margaret, who believed in knocking as a matter of character. She was holding an envelope, and her expression was the one she used when she had decided something was important before she fully understood why. "This came to my address by mistake," she said. "I think it was meant for you. The name's right, but the street's wrong." Eliza looked at the return address on the envelope. Whitfield and Crane, Dressmakers and Design, Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. She set down the skirt. "Sit down, Margaret," she said. "I'll stand. Open it." She opened it. The letter was from a woman named Dorothea Whitfield, co-proprietor of what the letterhead described as the largest dressmaking establishment in Cheyenne, serving a clientele that included the wives of 3 territorial legislators and the management of 2 major rail companies. The letter was direct, well-composed, and contained an offer. A position as senior seamstress with the possibility of creative input on seasonal collections, a salary that was nearly 3 times what Eliza cleared in a good month, and accommodation provided for herself and her daughter in a respectable boarding house 1 street from the shop. She read it twice. Margaret read it once over her shoulder, uninvited. "That's a serious offer," Margaret said. "Yes." "When did you contact them?" "I didn't," Eliza said. "I don't know how they know about me." She found out 2 days later when she wrote back to ask. Dorothea Whitfield replied promptly. A woman named Clara Forsyth had recommended her. Eliza turned that name over in her mind for a moment before it landed. Clara Forsyth was the wife of the man who owned the Hardcastle Ranch, who had commissioned the winter order, who had apparently been impressed enough with the finished work to mention Eliza's name to someone she knew in Cheyenne. It was the kind of thing that happened from word of mouth, from doing good work and having it travel. Eliza knew this was how it was supposed to work. She had believed in it theoretically. Having it actually happen felt strange in a way she hadn't anticipated, like being seen from a distance by someone you didn't know was watching. She put the letter in her document folder next to Voss's correspondence and Voss's notices, and she went back to the wool skirt. She didn't tell anyone else for a week. Not Margaret, who had already absorbed enough of the situation. Not Voss, who was busy with the county records and didn't need to factor her personal decisions into his legal work. Not Maisie, who would ask questions Eliza didn't have answers to yet. And not Caleb. She wasn't sure why that particular absence of telling felt the most deliberate. She thought about the offer while she worked. She thought about it at the kitchen table in the mornings. She thought about it while Maisie slept in the particular stillness of the house at night when there was nothing to listen to but her own thinking. Cheyenne was not an impossible distance, a day and a half by rail. It was a city with resources and infrastructure and the kind of professional world that Alder Creek would never be. The salary was real. The stability it would represent was real. And Alder Creek was a town where Harold Voss had been systematically dismantling what she had built, where the legal fight she was waging might produce a viable outcome, or might produce a partial one, where the future of her shop on Juniper Street was still technically unresolved. On paper, it was not a complicated decision. She sat with that for several more days before she admitted to herself that paper was not the only surface she was working on. Caleb came by on a Thursday to pick up a mended jacket. She had done the lining, which had given out at both elbows. And Maisie intercepted him at the door with a drawing she had made of what she described as a very serious horse. "He has 3 legs, Caleb observed. "He's working on the 4th, Maisie said. "Fair enough." He accepted the drawing with the gravity it was offered with and looked up at Eliza, who was behind the counter threading a needle. "Busy?" "Always." She tied off the thread. "The jacket's done. I'll get it." She got it from the rack in the back and came back out and set it on the counter. He checked the elbows, ran his thumb along the new lining, held it up briefly. He did this each time, not distrustfully, just in the straightforward way of someone accustomed to assessing work. "Good," he said. He paid what she asked without negotiating, which she had noticed was a consistent quality in him. Some of her customers treated every transaction like a negotiation. Caleb paid what things cost and moved on. He was folding the jacket over his arm when she said it. "I have a job offer from Cheyenne." She hadn't planned to say it then. It came out of the same place that things come from when you've been holding them too long and they find their own exit. He stopped folding. He finished folding. Then he looked at her. What kind of offer? She told him the broad shape of it, Whitfield and Crane, the salary, the position. She didn't editorialize. She presented it the way Foss would present evidence. Here is what exists, here are its dimensions. Caleb listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking about it," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means I haven't decided." He looked at her steadily. There was something working behind his eyes that she could see without being able to name, and then he set the jacket on the counter and said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Is the offer good because of what it is?" he said. "Or good because it's somewhere that isn't here?" The directness of it caught her. She looked at him for a long beat. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Okay," he said. He picked the jacket back up. She waited for the next part. The part where he told her what to do, or told her what he wanted, or laid out the reasons she should stay. Men she'd known had a way of filling the space between their own uncertainty and someone else's choice. Even good men. Even men who meant well. Caleb put his hat on. "I hope you figure it out," he said, and he went out the door. Eliza stood at the counter. From the corner, Maisie said, "Did you make him sad?" "I don't know," Eliza said. "He didn't look sad. He looked like his thinking face." "How do you know his thinking face?" Maisie considered. "It's like your thinking face, but with less frowning." Eliza picked up her needle. "Go find something to do, Maisie." "I am doing something. I'm observing. Find something else." Maisie went. She wrote to Dorothea Whitfield that afternoon. Not a yes and not a no. She asked for 2 weeks to consider, explained that she had ongoing matters requiring her attention, and said she was interested in understanding whether the position had any flexibility in its structure. She sent it before she could revise it into something more cautious. Dorothea Whitfield wrote back in 4 days. The boarding house arrangement was fixed, but the position itself had some flexibility. She was open to discussing exactly what senior seamstress could mean, and she admired directness in a prospective employee. She gave Eliza her 2 weeks. Foss came back from Millhaven during those 2 weeks. The county records office had agreed to flag the title transfer documentation for review. It was not the same as acting on it, but it meant the fraud question was now formally on record, which complicated Voss's ability to proceed with any property transfers until the review was resolved. The prosecutor in Millhaven was cautious but not dismissive. He had asked for 30 days to review Foss's materials before committing to any formal action. "That's progress," Eliza said. "It is," Foss confirmed. "It's also slow, and Voss knows about the flag. My contact at the records office is not as discreet as I would like." "So he'll move faster?" "Possibly, or he'll go quiet and wait to see if the review produces anything. It depends on how risk-averse he is." "He's not very risk-averse," Eliza said. "He sent someone here with a fake lease revision while you were in Laramie." Foss's expression sharpened. "You didn't tell me that. I told you in the letter. I hadn't gotten the letter yet when I left Millhaven." He held out his hand. "Let me see it." She gave him the document the smooth-voiced man had brought. Foss read it with the focused stillness of someone identifying exactly where a thing had gone wrong. He flipped to the second page, went back to the first. "This clause," he said, pointing, "this doesn't exist in any version of the original Ostroff leases. This is new language. New language means someone wrote it after the fact, which means someone inside Voss's operation is generating fraudulent documents, which is a much cleaner charge than title transfer irregularities." He looked up. "This is helpful, Mrs. Whitmore." "I kept it," she said. "You keep everything." "Yes." He took the document with him when he left, and she watched him go with the complicated feeling of someone who has handed over something important and trusts the person holding it, mostly, but is still aware of what trust costs. The 2 weeks ran down. On the last possible day, Eliza sat at her kitchen table in the early morning, 5 o'clock, Maisie asleep, the lamp burning, the ledger open. And she thought about what she actually wanted. Not what was smart, not what looked right on paper, what she actually wanted. Underneath the practicality and the planning and the 2 years of building something from nothing in a town that had taken things from her. She wanted the shop on Juniper Street. She wanted that specifically. Not a version of it in Cheyenne, not a position in someone else's establishment, however well compensated. She wanted the particular life she had made on her own terms in a place she had chosen. But wanting something and having a plan for keeping it were not the same thing. She picked up her pen. She wrote 2 letters, one to Dorothea Whitfield and one to Foss. The letter to Whitfield took 3 drafts. She did not say no. What she said, carefully, specifically, was that she was interested in a different arrangement than the one offered. She explained what she had built in Alder Creek, the existing client relationships, the quality of work she had established. She said she was interested in what a partnership arrangement might look like, not as an employee, but as an affiliated supplier and designer, providing work and designs that Whitfield could market to their larger clientele, while maintaining her independent operation in Alder Creek. She said she understood if this wasn't what they were looking for, and she thanked them for the offer. She sealed it before she could rethink it. The letter to Foss was simpler. She told him she intended to stay in Alder Creek and that the Cheyenne matter was resolved on her end. She said she wanted to know the next practical step. She put both letters by the door and went to make breakfast. When Maisie came out of the back room, hair on one side of her head pressed flat from sleep and her stockings on backward, she climbed up on her chair at the table and accepted her porridge and said, "Are we staying?" Eliza looked at her. "Were you listening?" "I heard the pen," Maisie said. "You write loud when you're deciding things." "Yes," Eliza said. "We're staying." Maisie ate her porridge. "Good," she said. "I don't want to move the horse picture." The drawing she'd made for Caleb was, apparently still in Maisie's mind, a mutual property. Eliza didn't correct this. Dorothea Whitfield's response came back in 8 days. It was longer than Eliza had expected, and what it said was that she had discussed the proposal with her co-proprietor Crane, and that while it was not the arrangement they had originally envisioned, they were interested. They proposed a trial arrangement, a seasonal commission, 2 collections per year, designs produced by Eliza and completed or finished by Whitfield's staff, with clear attribution and a fee structure that Whitfield spelled out in specific numbers. The numbers were good. Not what the original salary would have been, but fair for what it was, and what it was, if she was reading it correctly, was Whitfield and Crane buying access to a talent they had identified, while allowing her to keep the independence she had negotiated for without quite asking for it outright. She read the letter twice and felt something she didn't immediately recognize, and then recognized as the specific satisfaction of having asked for an unusual thing and been taken seriously. She wrote back and said yes. She celebrated by telling no one, sitting at the kitchen table for about 10 minutes with a cup of coffee going cold, and then getting up and going back to the shop. There was work to do. The period that followed was the strangest stretch of weeks Eliza could remember since the months immediately after Thomas's death. Not for grief, but for the particular sensation of too many things moving at once and not being able to see clearly which ones would land where. Foss was working the fraud angle. The county review was ongoing. Voss had gone quiet after Foss's Millhaven trip, which Eliza and Foss both read as him regrouping rather than retreating. The Whitfield arrangement was new and required careful management. She was drafting design sketches in the evenings after Maisie slept, work she hadn't done in years, finding the part of her brain that thought in shape and line and silhouette, which was a different kind of thinking from the precise construction of a finished garment. And Caleb. That was its own category. He had not brought up the Cheyenne offer again. He hadn't asked. He came by the shop at his usual intervals, slightly more frequent than could be explained entirely by mending needs which she had noticed and not acknowledged, and they talked about practical things. The Voss situation, Maisie's ongoing portfolio of abstract textile art, the condition of the road east of town, which had washed out in a recent rain. He was consistent in the way reliable things are consistent, without calling attention to it. It was the not calling attention to it that got to her. She had known men who needed credit for their reliability, who needed you to notice they had shown up. Caleb showed up and then turned his attention to whatever the actual situation was, and she wasn't sure she had encountered that combination before in a man who was also clearly interested in her as something more than a neighbor. She caught herself thinking about this one evening while she was pinning a collar, standing at the dress form in the half-light of the shop after closing, and she thought, this is what it looks like when someone's consistency is real and not performed. And then she thought, I don't entirely know what to do with that. She put it away. She finished the collar. She went to make dinner. The thing that broke the particular equilibrium of those weeks was not the Voss situation, which Eliza had been prepared for in various forms. It was something smaller and, in its way, more disorienting. Maisie got sick. Not seriously. A fever, a cough, the kind of winter illness that moves through children and leaves them wrung out and demanding for several days before it passes. But it started on a Monday morning when Eliza had 2 clients coming in for fittings, a delivery of fabric she'd been waiting on for 3 weeks, and a letter from Foss that required a response by Wednesday. She sent notes to the clients, rescheduled the fittings, arranged for the fabric delivery to go to Margaret's shop next door. She sat with Maisie in the back room with a cool cloth and a bowl of thin broth and the kind of patient attention that sick children require and that takes everything you have because it can't be done halfway. By Tuesday, Maisie's fever was higher and she'd stopped wanting broth and was asking for stories. The same 2 stories repeated in specific order, and Eliza told them until her voice went rough. She had not slept properly in 2 nights when Caleb knocked on the shop door on Wednesday morning. She hadn't told him. She hadn't told anyone except Margaret, who had taken the fabric delivery without asking questions. He was there because Margaret had told him, she found out later. He had stopped by to ask if there was anything he could do, and Margaret had said, she won't ask for help, she never asked for help, go see for yourself. Eliza opened the door and looked at him, and she was aware that she was not in a presentable state. Her hair was down, she was in her working dress with a stain on the front from the broth, and she had the flattened eyes of someone who had not slept in more than 36 hours. She said, Maisie's sick. I'm fine. I don't need anything. Caleb looked at her. You look like you need someone to sit with her for 2 hours so you can sleep. I'm not going to leave her with Eliza. Not sharp, not pressuring, just her name, said level, with a quality in it that she didn't have a word for. When did you last sleep? She didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. I'll sit with her, he said. 2 hours. You sleep. I'll wake you if anything changes. She doesn't know you that well. She knows me well enough to show me her portfolio, he said. Let me sit with her. There was a particular kind of exhaustion that passes its own threshold and becomes a different thing, and Eliza had reached that threshold sometime during the night. She stood in the doorway and looked at this man who had driven 4 miles from his ranch to stand on her step on a Wednesday morning because someone had told him she needed help she wasn't going to ask for. She stepped back from the door. He came inside. She took him to the back room and showed him where the broth was and where the cool cloths were and what stories Maisie had been asking for. Maisie looked up from her pillow with fever-bright eyes and said, You came. I came, he said. He pulled the chair close to the bed and sat in it without making a production of it. Your mama says you like the one about the fort. The princess has a horse, Maisie said, her voice thin and important. It's not finished yet. Tell me what you've got so far. Eliza stood in the doorway for another moment, watching. Then she went to the front room, sat down on the bench against the wall, and was asleep in approximately 4 minutes. She slept for 3 hours. When she woke, the shop was quiet in a different way than it was when she was alone in it. A lived-in quiet, a someone else is here quiet. And she came to herself slowly, aware of where she was and why. She went to the back room. Caleb was asleep in the chair with his chin dropped toward his chest, which was not dignified but was deeply human. Maisie was asleep in the bed, her breathing easier than it had been, the fever cloth folded neatly on the edge of the bowl. Someone, Caleb, she assumed, had brought the blanket from the foot of the bed up around Maisie's shoulders. Eliza stood in the doorway and felt something so complicated it didn't fit into language, so she didn't try to put it there. She went to the kitchen and made coffee. When she came back, Caleb was awake, scrubbing his face with one hand, looking at the middle distance with the slightly abashed expression of someone who had not meant to fall asleep. "She's better," he said. "Fever broke about an hour in. She told me the whole horse story 3 times. I know it now." "How does it end?" "The horse gets the 4th leg," he said. "That's a recent development." Eliza handed him a cup of coffee. He took it and looked up at her, and she looked back, and neither of them said what was in the room. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "Margaret said you needed—"
"I know what Margaret said." She sat down in the other chair. "I'm still thanking you." He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Through the wall, they could hear Maisie's breathing, slow and even now.
"The Whitfield offer," Caleb said after a while. "Did you decide?" She looked at her cup. "I negotiated something different," she said. "I'm staying." He was quiet. "I didn't do it because of this," she said, meaning the room, meaning him, meaning whatever had been accumulating between them for weeks. "I did it because it's what I wanted, the shop, Alder Creek, the life I built here." "I know," he said. "I need you to know that clearly." "I do know it," he said, "and I'm glad you're staying." A pause. "Those are 2 separate things I can hold at the same time." She looked at him then, really looked at him. The tiredness in his face, the coffee cup in his large, work-worn hands, the particular quality of his attention that never moved to claim anything it wasn't offered. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her the way the young love, with the whole assumption of a future that is still entirely imaginary. And she thought about who she was now, not worse than that younger self, not better, but formed in ways that Thomas hadn't been part of, shaped by things she had carried alone, load-bearing in places she hadn't needed to be before. She thought, this man has not tried once to carry something for her that she could carry herself, and that was so rare it almost felt like its own kind of landmark. She didn't say any of this. What she said was, "I'll need another hour before I can get back to the letter for Foss." "I can go," he said. "You can stay until your coffee's done," she said, "if you want." He stayed until his coffee was done. Then he put on his hat and he went back to his ranch 4 miles east of town, and Eliza went to check on Maisie, who was sleeping with one arm thrown above her head and her mouth slightly open. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to her daughter breathe. Outside the window, the afternoon light was moving, as it always did, and inside the small house on Juniper Street, Eliza Whitmore sat with the specific weight of a decision she had already made and thought about what it meant to want something that wasn't just for surviving. She thought about it for a while. Then Maisie stirred and opened her eyes and said, "Does the horse have a name yet?" "Not yet," Eliza said. "I'm working on it," Maisie said with great seriousness and closed her eyes again. Eliza stayed where she was. The afternoon light kept moving. Maisie was fully recovered by the following Monday, which she celebrated by producing what she called her most important pattern yet. A large, aggressively asymmetrical piece of muslin that she insisted represented the ranch 4 miles east of town, though she had never been there. "How do you know what it looks like?" Eliza asked. "I imagined it," Maisie said, with the tone of someone explaining something obvious. Eliza pinned it to the wall above Maisie's bed without comment, next to the drawing of the 3-legged horse, which had apparently been promoted from portfolio piece to permanent installation. The horse still didn't have a name. Maisie was, she said, still working on it. Life had a way of returning to its shape after disruption, and the week after Maisie's illness had that quality, the particular texture of normal things resuming. Clients came back for their rescheduled fittings. The fabric from the delayed delivery turned out to be slightly the wrong weight for the original order, which required renegotiation with the supplier and an adjustment to the design. Foss sent a letter saying the prosecutor in Millhaven had asked for an additional 2 weeks, which Foss read as cautious momentum rather than stalling, though he admitted the distinction was not always clear. And Eliza worked on the first design sketches for Whitfield and Crane, which she did in the evenings at the kitchen table after Maisie slept, in a small notebook she had bought specifically for the purpose. She wasn't certain the designs were right yet. She had been making things other people ordered for 2 years, which was one kind of skill, and now she was making things from her own judgment about what was worth making, which was a different and more uncomfortable kind. The discomfort was, she had decided, probably necessary. It was in the middle of this week, ordinary in every surface way, that Caleb made his mistake. She didn't know about it for 3 days. That was the thing that made it worse in the end. Not the mistake itself, but the 3 days of not knowing, during which she had been moving through her normal life while something had been decided about her space without her knowing. She found out on a Thursday afternoon when she went to the ranch. She had not been to the ranch before. She had been 4 miles east of town in her mind, in the approximate shape of it that Maisie had imagined in muslin, but she had never had a reason to go. The reason she went that Thursday was practical. Caleb had left a length of leather trim in the shop 3 weeks ago that he'd meant to have replaced on a pair of riding gloves, and he'd been so consistently busy stopping by for other reasons that the gloves had simply stayed. She had finished them and was passing the East Road on an errand and thought, without a great deal of deliberation, that she would drop them off. It was not a significant decision. That was the part that stayed with her afterward. How unmomentous it had felt to turn her wagon east. The ranch was not what Maisie's muslin had suggested, which had implied something large and complicated. It was, in fact, modest in the way that things are modest when someone is still rebuilding them. Solid bones, evidence of recent work in the fencing and the barn roof, a yard that had been functional rather than finished. She had expected this, knowing what she knew about the winter that had taken most of his cattle. What she had not expected was the window. She saw it from the wagon before she got down. The room on the north side of the house had a new curtain in the window. Not new in the sense of clean, but new in the sense of recently added, because she was certain it hadn't been there the one time she'd glimpsed the outside of the house from the road. And the window itself had a quality of arrangement about it that the other windows didn't. Something positioned behind the glass that caught the afternoon light. She got down from the wagon and knocked. Caleb came to the door with the look of someone who had been working and hadn't expected company. He saw it was her, and something happened in his expression. Not guilt, exactly. More like a man who has been caught in the middle of something he'd been hoping to explain in a different order. Eliza. I brought the gloves, she said. She held them out. I was passing the road. He took the gloves. Come in, he said. She came in. The front room was as she remembered it. The books, the reading lamp, the rug with color still in it. She followed him toward the back of the house, because he was moving that way, and he either didn't realize she was following or didn't know how to stop it without making it more significant than a natural pause would have. She saw the room before he could arrange how she saw it. The door was open. It was a room she hadn't been in on her first visit. Smaller than the front room on the north side of the house, with the window she had noticed from the wagon. In the window there was a sewing table, a second-hand machine, a good lamp positioned exactly where the light would fall correctly for close work. The table was clear, ready. The lamp was clean. Against the wall, someone had put up a small shelf. Not a built-in, just a shelf that had been attached with care, the kind of thing you do when you're thinking about what someone will need to store. She stood in the doorway. Caleb stopped beside her. He looked at the room. He looked at her face, and she could see the moment he understood that the order he had planned, whatever explanation he had prepared, was not going to be the order it happened in. I built it for you, he said. I wanted you to have a place here. When you came here, I wanted you to have somewhere to work, so you wouldn't have to choose between. Stop, she said. He stopped. She was looking at the table, at the machine, at the shelf. Looking at all the thought that had gone into it, because thought had clearly gone into it. The placement of the lamp, the height of the shelf, the fact that it was a second-hand machine and not a cheap one, which meant he had known the difference. She could see the care in it from where she stood. That was what made it so difficult. You built this, she said, without telling me. I wanted it to be without asking me, she said. He was quiet. Caleb. She turned from the doorway and looked at him. Her voice was level. She had made it level deliberately, the way she made things level when what was underneath them was the opposite. Do you understand what you've done? I wanted to show you that there was a place for you here, he said. That I'd thought about what you'd need, that this wasn't just that I was serious about. I know what you meant, she said. I understand exactly what you meant, and I can see every bit of the care you put into this, and that is not the same thing as it being right. He looked at her. I had the expression of a man who has done something he believed was generous and has been told it was something else, and is in the process of trying to feel the difference between those two things. Explain it to me, he said. Not defensive, just explain it to me. She took a breath. I spent 2 years building a life that belongs to me. Every decision in my shop is mine. Every arrangement, every client, every piece of work. I didn't get there by having things built for me while I wasn't looking. She paused. You put a sewing table in a room in your house without asking if I wanted a room in your house. You might want one, he said, quiet but not backing away from it. Maybe, she said, that is a conversation we haven't had, and it's a conversation that would have to start with you asking, not with me arriving to find the answer already built. Something in his face was working through something. She could see it. He wasn't arguing, wasn't defending, wasn't retreating. He was actually listening, which was the thing she had noticed about him from the early days, and which was the reason this was so hard to be angry about cleanly. I grew up solving things, he said eventually. My father was the same. You see a problem, you find the shape of the fix, you build it before the problem gets worse. It's how everything on a ranch works. He looked at the room. I looked at what you were dealing with. Voss, the offer from Cheyenne, carrying everything. And I saw something I could do, so I did it. I know, Eliza said, and that is exactly the problem. I was not a problem to solve. The word landed. She could see it land. No, he said, you weren't. He said it slowly, like someone putting something down after carrying it a long way. You weren't, and I treated it like you were. The room was quiet. The afternoon light came through the window she had noticed from the wagon and fell across the sewing table in a clean, even line. You're going to have to take it down, she said. He looked at her. Not the shelf necessarily, she said. Not even the machine if you want to keep it. But this room, as you've arranged it, as a place built for me in the shape of a decision about my future, you need to take it down. And then if we ever have a conversation about what I might want here, it starts from nothing. From asking. He nodded. One nod, deliberate. I'll have it cleared by the weekend, he said. Thank you. She picked up her coat, which she had set on the back of a chair in the front room. He walked her to the door. Outside, the late afternoon had gone a darker gold, and the yard had the lengthened shadows of the turning season. At the wagon, she stopped. She had been going over in the back of her mind whether to say the next part or leave it unsaid. She had decided by the time she reached the wagon that leaving it unsaid was the kind of thing she did when she was being careful in ways that didn't serve her. She turned back to him. He was standing on the step, his hat in his hands. What you felt, she said, when you were building that room, the wanting to make a place for someone, the caring enough to think about what they'd need, that isn't wrong. The impulse isn't wrong. She held his eyes. But I can't be loved by someone who builds the future and then shows it to me. I need someone who builds it with me from the start. He was very still. I understand that, he said. I know you do, she said. That's why I'm telling you instead of just leaving. She got up on the wagon and drove back toward town. She did not let herself look back. Not because she didn't want to, but because she had said what she needed to say, clearly, without apology, and looking back would have made it into something it wasn't. She drove the 4 miles into Alder Creek with the specific tiredness of someone who has done a hard thing correctly and gets no prize for it except having done it. Margaret was locking up her shop when Eliza came down Juniper Street. How was the East Road? Margaret asked, because Margaret noticed everything and pretended to be asking about roads when she was asking about something else. Fine, Eliza said. Margaret looked at her face. What happened? Nothing that needs discussing tonight. Margaret accepted this, which was one of the reasons Eliza valued her. Foss sent a note, she said. Left it under your door. Looks like there's news. The note from Foss was brief. The county prosecutor had agreed to move on the fraud case. Not on all counts, but on the forged document that Voss's representative had brought to Eliza's shop, which was the cleanest and most provable piece of the case. The prosecutor intended to file within the week. Voss had been notified through his legal representative that his property acquisitions in Alder Creek were under formal review, and that any further attempts to modify or terminate existing lease agreements would be subject to legal scrutiny. At the bottom, in Voss's particular handwriting, your documentation made this possible. I'll be in Alder Creek Friday. She put the note on the table. She sat down. She had been fighting Harold Voss for the better part of 5 months. She had documented, organized, connected, negotiated, and pushed through a system that was not designed to move quickly or in her favor. And now it was moving. She thought she would feel more purely glad about it. She did feel glad, but the gladness was mixed with the tiredness of the afternoon, the drive back from the ranch, the conversation that had been necessary and costly in the specific way that necessary things sometimes are. She made dinner. She fed Maisie. She told Maisie a story about the princess in the fort and the horse with 4 legs whose name was, Maisie had decided during her recovery week, either Franklin or something that started with an F. Franklin is a good name, Eliza said. It might be Frederick, Maisie said. Also good. I'll know when I know, Maisie said with the finality of someone who has considered the matter fully. She went to sleep. Eliza sat at the table and worked on the second design sketch for Whitfield, which was going better than the first. She worked until the lamp needed trimming, and then she trimmed it and kept working. She did not think about Caleb. She thought about him anyway, around the edges of the work, the way you think about something you've set in a different part of the room, aware of it without looking directly at it. She wondered if she had asked too much. Then she thought, no, you asked for the correct thing. Whether it's too much is a question about what he's capable of, and you don't know that yet. She closed the notebook and went to bed. Foss came on Friday as promised, and what he laid out on her shop counter was the shape of a resolution that was not perfect and was not a story. It was a legal proceeding, which meant it was slow and partial and subject to change. Voss had engaged a lawyer from Cheyenne, a better one than the Alder Creek lawyer Voss had been using, which meant he was taking the charges seriously. The fraud case on the forged document was solid, but Voss's lawyer was going to argue that the document had been prepared by a junior employee without Voss's authorization. Is that credible? Eliza asked. It's a credible defense strategy, Voss said. Whether it holds depends on what we can establish about Voss's awareness. We have the document. We have your account of the man who delivered it. If we can identify who that man is and establish his relationship to Voss directly, he was smooth, Eliza said. Well-dressed, young, he spoke like someone used to delivering unpleasant information and being thanked for it. That's not uncommon among certain kinds of property management. Foss made a note. Did he give his name? No, he didn't introduce himself. Any markings on the document? Any office address? Any firm name? She had kept the document. She got it from her folder and they went through it together. There was, at the bottom of the second page in very small type, an address in Denver and the name of a company she didn't recognize. Foss recognized it. His expression did the thing it did when something significant had been confirmed. That's Aldrich's parent company, he said. They made an error. What kind of error? They used letterhead from their Denver operation on a document that was supposed to look like a local lease modification. It connects Voss's Alder Creek operation directly to the parent company. He looked at her steadily. This changes the scale of the case. How? It suggests the fraud isn't a local overstep by a low-level employee. It's coordinated, which means the prosecutor's office may have grounds to contact the Denver authorities, and that changes what Voss is facing. He paused. It also means Voss knows he's in more trouble than he initially thought, which means his next move will be to settle. Eliza looked at the document, at the tiny print at the bottom of the second page. She had read this document 4 times and hadn't seen the significance of that address. Foss had looked at it for 30 seconds. What does settling look like? She asked. He withdraws from the Alder Creek properties, transfers them to an independent trustee probably, walks away from what he paid for them minus legal costs. Foss gathered his papers. The other tenants on Juniper Street will need to be informed, Margaret Hollis and the others. I'll tell them. I'd expect a settlement offer within 3 weeks, possibly less if his lawyer is efficient. She nodded. She was doing the accounting in her head, not just the financial one, but the accounting of what the past months had cost in time and attention and the specific exhaustion of sustained careful work. Will the shop be safe? She said. I believe so, Foss said. I won't promise what I can't guarantee, but this is the best position you've been in since Voss arrived. After he left, she stood at the counter for a moment. Margaret knocked and then opened the door without waiting because Margaret knew that Foss had been in. Well, she said. Eliza told her. Margaret listened with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and when it was done, she said, So it works out. It might work out, Eliza said. There are still steps. But the direction is right. The direction is right. Margaret nodded. She looked around the shop, the dress form, the pincushion, the rack of work in progress along the side wall, the corner chair where Maisie had fallen asleep on the evening that had started all of this, the evening Eliza had walked across town with her daughter on her hip, prepared for a disaster that hadn't been one. Good, Margaret said, and she went back to her own shop. Saturday came. Eliza worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and she was closing up when she heard the sound of a wagon outside. She didn't look up immediately. Wagons went past on Juniper Street at all hours. Then she heard footsteps on the step and the knock. She opened the door. Caleb was standing outside with his hat in his hands. He had the look of a man who had spent some days with a difficult thing and had come out on the other side of it with something to say. I cleared the room, he said. Thursday. She looked at him. All right. I want to say something else, he said, if you'll let me. She stepped back from the door. He came inside and stood in the middle of the shop, not too close, not staged, at a careful distance, just there. I've been thinking about what you said, he started. Caleb, let me finish. He said it gently, but he said it. I've been thinking about what you said, and I've been thinking about why I built that room, and I've been honest with myself about it in a way I wasn't before. He looked at her directly. Part of it was what I told you. I see problems and I find fixes, that's true. But part of it was something I didn't tell you because I didn't understand it until after you left. She waited. I was scared, he said. That's the honest version. You were offered a life in Cheyenne that made complete sense on every practical measure, and I didn't have anything to offer that was better than that on paper, and I thought if I could show you something concrete, something physical, built, it would count as something. He paused. I was trying to compete with Cheyenne using lumber and a second-hand machine. The admission sat in the air between them. That's very human, she said, after a moment. It was very stupid, he said. Also that. Something in his face shifted towards something that wasn't quite a smile. I'm not going to do things like that, he said. I'm not going to promise I won't ever act before I think, because that would be a promise I'd break inside a year and you'd know it. But that specific thing, deciding the shape of your future without asking, I understand now why it was wrong in a way I didn't before. Not just that it upset you. Why it was actually wrong. Eliza looked at him. She was measuring something, though she couldn't have said exactly what its units were. What changed? She asked. I thought about Thomas, he said. She hadn't expected that. You told me he paid attention, Caleb said, that he noticed things, that he knew when you were having a hard day before you said it. He turned his hat in his hands once. I don't think that's a small thing. I think that's the whole thing, actually. And I've been telling myself I do that. Pay attention, notice things. But what I built in that room says different. Because if I'd been paying attention, I'd have known that's not how you want to be loved. The shop was very quiet. Outside, the street had its ordinary sounds. And in here, there was just the two of them and the late afternoon light and the dress form in the corner and the pincushion on the counter. Eliza felt something move in her chest. She didn't perform it and she didn't explain it. She just let it be there. I don't want you to be Thomas, she said. I want you to be who you are. I know, he said. I'm not trying to be. I'm trying to tell you I understand something I didn't before. I heard you, she said. He nodded. He was still turning his hat in his hands and she reached out and put her hand on his. Not dramatically, not with intention beyond stopping the motion, just a hand on his hands. He went still. She took her hand back. Foss thinks Voss is going to settle, she said, within 3 weeks. He took a moment to follow the change. Then, that's good news. It's good news if it holds. Is Foss reliable? As reliable as lawyers get, she said, which is not the same as certain. No, he agreed. It never is. She moved behind the counter and began putting away the pins she'd been working with, the small practice movements of closing up the shop. Caleb stayed where he was, not filling the space, not crowding it. You can come to Sunday dinner, she said without looking up from the pins. If you want. Maisie has been talking about showing you the horse's name. She decided on Franklin. The pause was brief and real. What time? He said. 6, she said. Don't bring anything. Just come. All right, he said. She looked up. Howe was looking at her with that expression, the real one, the one that changed his whole face. And she looked back at him steadily and let herself feel the weight and the rightness and the uncertainty of it without flinching from any of the three. Good night, Caleb, she said. Good night, Eliza. He put his hat on. He went out the door. The bell rang. She stood in the quiet of the shop with her pins sorted and her dress form in the corner and the last of the day's light coming through the front window, and she thought about what it meant to let someone back into the space they'd partially occupied and partially misunderstood, and to do it with eyes open instead of hope alone. It was not the same as certainty. She had learned enough by now to stop mistaking one for the other, but it was something. It was the right kind of something. Built from saying the hard thing and hearing it received, from a man who could be wrong and say so and mean it, from the particular courage it took to ask for what you actually needed and then wait and see if someone was capable of it. Sunday was 3 days away. She finished closing the shop. She went home to her daughter, who had named the horse Franklin and was now working, she said, on a portrait of him to hang beside the pattern that was the ranch, beside the picture that was the third chair at the dinner table. Eliza stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at the wall where these things were accumulating: the horse, the muslin, the drawing. And she thought that her daughter was building something in her own way, with the materials she had in the shape she understood. She thought, maybe that's what all of us are doing. She went to make dinner, and the lamp burned warm, and outside the season was turning, and the shop on Juniper Street was, for now, still hers. Sunday dinner was pot roast, because it was what Eliza knew how to make in quantity without thinking too hard about it, and she had enough thinking to do that week without adding the menu. Caleb arrived at 6, exactly. Not 5:50, not 6:10. 6. She noticed this and told herself it was a small thing, and it was, but small things have a way of accumulating into a picture of who someone is, and she had been collecting this particular picture for months now without quite acknowledging she was doing it. Maisie answered the door before Eliza could get there, which was expected, and immediately presented Caleb with the news about Franklin in the manner of someone who has been saving an important announcement. "The horse has a name," she said. "I heard," Caleb said. "Franklin." Maisie looked briefly betrayed. "Mama told you?" "She mentioned it." "It was supposed to be a surprise." "It still is," he said. "Hearing a name and meeting the horse are different things." Maisie considered this and apparently found it acceptable, because she stepped back from the door and let him in. She then led him directly to the wall in the back room where the portfolio pieces had migrated: the three-legged horse drawing, the muslin pattern of the ranch, and a newer addition that Eliza had not examined closely yet, which Maisie now presented as Franklin's official portrait. Caleb looked at it for a genuine moment. Franklin was, in the portrait, a commanding presence rendered in brown crayon with 4 legs of varying lengths and an expression of considerable dignity. "He looks serious," Caleb said. "He has responsibilities," Maisie said. "What kind of responsibilities?" Maisie thought about it. "Ranch things," she said. Caleb nodded, like this was a complete answer, because in a way it was, and Eliza watched from the doorway with a potholder in her hand and felt something quiet and warm move through her that she didn't try to name or catalog or examine for safety. She just let it be there. Dinner was good. Not in the elevated, self-conscious way of people on best behavior, but in the ordinary way of a meal that was hot and filling and shared between people who had stopped performing for each other some time ago. Maisie talked about Franklin and about a girl at the neighbor's house she had decided was her best friend, and about a question she had been developing for several days concerning whether horses dreamed. Caleb said he believed they did. Eliza said she didn't know. Maisie said she thought they probably dreamed about grass, which she considered a reasonable thing to dream about. After dinner, Maisie lasted until nearly 7:30 before she went down, which was a record. Eliza settled her in the back room and came back out to find Caleb had cleared the dishes to the kitchen without being asked, which she had mixed feelings about and chose not to address. They sat at the table with coffee and the lamp between them, and the particular quiet of a house after a child has gone to sleep. "Voss sent word this morning," Eliza said. "Voss's lawyer made contact. They want to discuss terms." Caleb looked up from his cup. "That's fast." Voss said the Denver connection scared them. The parent company doesn't want exposure in a second territory. She wrapped her hands around the cup. "They're going to offer to transfer the Juniper Street properties to an independent trustee and waive any outstanding disputed claims. In exchange, the tenants agree not to pursue the fraud case further." "That's not nothing," Caleb said. "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing. It's also not everything. What's missing?" She thought about how to put it. Voss walks away. He doesn't face a consequence that prevents him from doing this to someone else somewhere else. He just absorbs the loss and moves on. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Is there a version where he faces more? Voss says possibly, if the Denver authorities pick it up. But that's not certain, and it's not in our control, and pursuing it here would mean months more of legal work and uncertainty. She looked at the lamp. Voss said to think about what I actually want, not what would be satisfying in principle, what I actually want. What do you want? She had been sitting with this question for 2 days. I want my shop, she said. I want the other tenants on Juniper Street to be safe. I want Voss to have less leverage than he had 6 months ago. She paused. I want to stop spending my evenings writing letters about Harold Voss. Something in Caleb's expression moved. understanding, she thought, or the specific recognition of someone who has heard a person say a true thing about their own exhaustion. That sounds like a settlement, he said. It sounds like one, she agreed. Can you live with it? She thought about Margaret Hollis with her folder of documents organized by date, about the Huang family who had asked twice whether it was safe and then said yes anyway, about Dora Satterley who had changed her mind and sent her son around in the evening because she was scared but came anyway, about Ruth Partridge in Laramie who had kept every piece of correspondence because she'd known something was wrong and hadn't been able to prove it until now. Yes, she said. I can live with it. Caleb nodded. He turned his cup in his hands. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want to ask it correctly this time. She looked at him. The lamp was steady between them. I cleared that room out completely, he said. It's empty. And I've been thinking about what you said, that if there's ever a conversation about what you might want there, it starts from nothing. From asking. He looked at her directly, and she could see the effort it took, not because he was afraid, but because he was being careful in a way that mattered to him. So, I'm asking. Not making, not building, not arranging, just asking. Is there anything you might want there? The question sat between them in its plain form. Eliza looked at this man across her kitchen table, the tiredness in his face from a week of ranch work, the cup he was holding with both hands, the hat on the hook by the door where it had landed when Maisie took it off him the moment he came in. She thought about all the things he was not. He was not easy. He was not without his own habits and failures. He was not the young version of love she had known with Thomas. He had built a room without asking and had understood why that was wrong and had said so plainly. He had driven 4 miles to sit with a sick child so she could sleep. He had offered a name and not a solution, and had listened when she told him the difference mattered. He was imperfect in specific ways she had cataloged without meaning to, and she thought that was probably the most honest thing she could say about why she trusted him. I don't know yet, she said. That's the honest answer. He nodded. But I'd like to find out, she said, at the right pace, without either of us building ahead of where we actually are. That's what I want too, he said, for what it's worth. It's worth something, she said. It's worth being said plainly. He looked at her for a moment, and then he looked at the lamp, and then he said, The east pasture fence needs replacing this winter. It's a bigger job than I can do alone efficiently. He said it to the lamp, not quite to her, like he was thinking out loud. I thought about asking Ned Coulter's son, who's looking for work, but I could use someone who's good at measuring. She understood what he was doing. She felt the corner of her mouth pull. That's a fairly transparent segue, she said. I know, he said. I'm trying to ask if you'd want to see the ranch sometime, without making it into something it doesn't have to be. Maisie would want to come, I assumed. She'll spend the whole time interrogating Franklin. Franklin doesn't exist yet as a real horse, Caleb said, but there's a bay gelding named something considerably less dignified that she could meet. What's his name? Caleb looked slightly uncomfortable. The previous owner called him Biscuit. Eliza laughed. It came out before she could measure it, a real laugh, the unguarded kind, and she heard it leave her and thought, there it is. There's what's been underneath all the careful months of practicality and management and deliberate progress. Caleb was smiling the real smile, the slow one. Don't, she said, still laughing. I'm not saying anything, he said. You're thinking it. I'm thinking that Thomas's biscuits were a character flaw and now there's a horse named Biscuit and that is apparently the funniest thing that's happened in this kitchen in some time. She got herself under control. She pressed her hand to her mouth. Those are not related things. No, he agreed. Absolutely not. She laughed again, shorter this time, and then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling and let herself feel the specific lightness of something that didn't require analysis or defense. After a moment, she looked at him. We'll come Saturday, she said, if the weather holds. I'll have the place in order. Don't fuss over it, she said. Just have it be what it is. He nodded. He understood what she meant. He left around 8:30 with his hat retrieved from the hook. Maisie had hung it high enough that he had to reach for it, which Eliza thought was not accidental. And the particular quality of departure that belongs to endings that are also the beginning of something else. She washed the cups. She put out the lamp. She checked on Maisie, who was sleeping spread eagle and completely committed to it, one hand still faintly curled around the crayon she'd fallen asleep with. Eliza pried the crayon loose and set it on the shelf and stood there in the dark of the back room listening. Outside, the wagon sounds of Caleb leaving on the east road. Inside, Maisie's breathing. The particular silence of a house that had, over 2 years, become hers in a way that had nothing to do with whose name was on the lease. She thought about Harold Voss. She thought about how it had started. The paper dropped on her cutting table without a greeting, without removing his hat, the flat smile that never reached his eyes. She thought about what that kind of power counted on, that people would be too tired, too alone, too busy surviving to organize, that they would each absorb the pressure separately and eventually break separately one by one, never understanding that what was happening to them was also happening to the person 2 doors down. She thought about what had actually happened instead. Margaret with her folder, Ned Coulter's compressed fury, the Huang family's quiet courage, Dora Satterley changing her mind. Ruth Partridge in Laramie, who had kept every letter because she trusted that keeping things mattered even when you couldn't yet see why. The settlement meeting happened on a Wednesday, 11 days after the initial contact from Voss's lawyer. Voss managed it with the efficient precision of someone who had been through negotiations like this before and knew exactly where the pressure points were. Voss was not present himself. He sent his Cheyenne lawyer, a woman named Edith Crane, who was sharp and professional and clearly had no personal investment in Harold Voss beyond her fee, which made her, Voss said afterward, a much more reasonable opponent than Voss himself would have been. The terms were what Voss had predicted. The Juniper Street properties transferred to an independent trustee to be named within 30 days. All disputed claims from any tenant waived. All outstanding lease modifications rescinded, with original Ostroff-era lease terms restored. In exchange, the tenants signed a document limiting their legal exposure to actions already on record. Margaret Hollis read every word of the document before she signed it. The Huang family had a cousin translate the key sections before they signed. Ned Coulter signed in about 45 seconds, which made Voss visibly nervous. Dora Satterley's hands were shaking when she held the pen, and she signed anyway. Eliza signed last. She held the pen for a moment over the page and looked at her name already printed at the bottom in Voss's clean type. Eliza Ann Whitmore. She had not used the middle name since Thomas died. It had felt like something from a different life, a life with a different shape. Seeing it here, in this document, felt like something being returned. She signed. Outside the building afterward, on the street in the October cold, the 5 of them stood for a moment in the awkward way of people who have been through something together and are not sure how to mark the end of it. "Well," Margaret said. "Well," Ned said. The Huang family, Mr. and Mrs. Huang and their eldest daughter who had translated, looked at each other and then at the group, and Mrs. Huang said something in Cantonese that her daughter translated as, "She says, now we go back to work." "Yes," Eliza said. "We do." Voss shook hands with each of them. When he got to Eliza, he held her hand for an extra moment. "You built this case," he said. "The documentation, the tenants, Ruth Partridge. None of it exists without the work you did before you contacted me. You built the legal argument," she said, "from materials you provided." He let go of her hand. "You should know that. Correctly." She thanked him. She meant it. She walked back to the shop on Juniper Street alone because she needed the walk. The morning was cold and bright, and the street was its ordinary self. The print shop with Ned's sign in the window. The alteration shop with Margaret's lamp already burning, the laundry with its particular smell of steam and soap. Her shop with the wooden sign Thomas had helped her put up, slightly uneven on the left side because he'd measured twice and cut once and still gotten it marginally wrong, which was the kind of thing she had found maddening once and would never change now. She unlocked the door and went inside. She stood in the middle of her shop, the dress form in the corner, the pincushion on the counter, the rack of work along the wall, the front window with its particular angle of morning light, the chair in the corner where Maisie had fallen asleep the first night, the night that had started everything. She thought about who she had been when she walked through this door for the first time, a year into her widowhood, with nothing except the sewing machine and the determination not to disappear. She thought about what it had cost to build this. Not just in money and work, though it had cost those things, but in the daily choice to keep going when keeping going was the only option she could afford. In the smaller choices, the ones nobody saw, deciding to listen instead of speak in certain conversations, deciding to keep documents that seemed unimportant at the time, deciding to post a letter to a lawyer in Crayston when she wasn't sure he would take her seriously. She had not survived 2 years in Alder Creek by being lucky, though she had been that too sometimes. She had survived by paying attention, by treating the small choices as though they mattered, because they did, because the small choices are the only ones most of us actually get to make, and the big outcomes are just what happens when enough small choices point in the same direction long enough. She hung up her coat, she tied her apron, she went to work. Saturday came with the particular clarity of late October, the kind of day that looks like a painting of autumn rather than autumn itself. Too bright, too sharp, the colors doing too much. Eliza dressed Maisie in her warmest things, an operation that required negotiation because Maisie had opinions about her hat, and they were strong opinions. "It covers my ears," Maisie said. "That's what it's supposed to do." "I can't hear things as well." "You hear plenty," Eliza said, and got the hat on. They took the wagon east. Maisie sat beside her mother on the bench and narrated the landscape as it went by with the focused commentary of someone reporting from the field. There were 2 crows on a fence post. The grass was the yellow-brown color of things that had been alive and were resting. The sky was the kind of blue that meant cold. "Is the ranch big?" Maisie asked. "Medium, I think." "Does Franklin know we're coming?" "Franklin doesn't know anything yet," Eliza said. "Franklin is a name for a horse we haven't met." "He'll know when we tell him," Maisie said, with the certainty of someone who has thought about this. Caleb was in the yard when they came up the road, doing something with a section of fence rail that he set down when he heard the wagon. He was not fussed over. His clothes were work clothes, his face was cold reddened, and he had what appeared to be a smear of mud on his left forearm that he had noticed and not done anything about. He looked exactly like a man who had been working on a Saturday morning on his own land. Maisie climbed down from the wagon before Eliza had fully stopped it, which caused a brief moment of managed alarm, and then announced to Caleb that she was ready to meet the horse. "Good morning to you too," he said. Maisie looked at him. "Good morning. Now, can I meet the horse?" "Yes," he said. He looked at Eliza with an expression that was mostly amusement. "She's direct." "I've mentioned this," Eliza said. The horse was in the barn. Biscuit was a bay gelding of medium height and considerable placidity, which was exactly what you wanted when introducing a nearly 5-year-old to an animal 12 times her size. He accepted Maisie's inspection with the weary patience of someone who has seen many small humans and found them mostly harmless. Maisie examined his face, his ears, his mane. She put her small hand flat on his nose when Caleb showed her how. "His nose is soft," she said with wonder. "Most of them are," Caleb said. She stood there with her hand on the horse's nose for a long moment, very still in the particular way of children when something has genuinely reached them. "His name isn't Biscuit," she said. Caleb looked at Eliza. Eliza looked back with an expression that said, "I have no control over this." "What's his name?" Caleb asked. Maisie thought about it with great seriousness. "Franklin," she said. "I changed the name in my picture. The picture horse can have a different name." Caleb looked at the horse. "He looks like a Franklin," he said. "He does," Maisie agreed. Eliza watched this from the barn doorway, her daughter and this man and the horse that was now Franklin, and she felt something settle inside her that had been suspended for a long time. Not a resolution exactly. More like a weight finding its right place, the way things feel when you stop carrying them at the wrong angle. They walked the property after that, the 3 of them, at the pace that Maisie's legs and curiosity required, which was slow and frequently interrupted. Caleb showed her the east pasture he'd been fencing, and she inspected the work with the portfolio curator's eye for what was interesting. He showed her where the creek ran along the south edge of the land, and she crouched down in her good coat and looked at the water for a long time. "Is there fish?" she asked. "Some," Caleb said. "Can we eat them?" "If we catch them." "Can we come back and catch them?" He looked at Eliza. "We can talk about it," Eliza said. "That means yes later," Maisie told Caleb in a stage whisper. "I thought it might," he said. Walking back toward the house, Maisie ran ahead to check on Franklin again, which gave Eliza and Caleb a small window of quiet, the first real one of the morning. They walked at the same pace, close enough for the cold air to make the distance between them feel navigable. "Thank you for this," Eliza said. It meant something to her. "She's easy to have around," he said. "That's not me being polite. She's genuinely easy." "She exhausts me completely," Eliza said, also genuinely. He smiled. They walked. "Foss wrote me," she said. "The trustee has been named. The transfer documents are being prepared. He thinks it'll be completed within the month." "And after that?" "After that, the building has a neutral owner, my original lease is restored, and I go back to running a dressmaking shop on Juniper Street without someone trying to maneuver me out of it." She paused. "And Whitfield sends the commission details for the winter collection next week." "That's a full plate," he said. "It's the right plate," she said. "It's the one I built." He was quiet for a step or two. "I know," he said, and then, "I'm proud of you, for what it's worth from where I'm standing." She looked at him sideways. "It's worth something," she said, "from where you're standing." They came to the yard. Maisie was visible in the barn doorway, apparently introducing Franklin to the concept of her name. "I've been thinking," Caleb said. He said it carefully, the way he said things when he'd been sitting with them long enough to know their shape. "About what I want, not what makes sense on paper. What I actually want." She looked at him. "I want a life that has you in it," he said. "And Maisie. Not a life where you've moved into mine. A life we've built to fit both of us. I don't know exactly what that looks like, and I'm not going to build it before you've told me what you want in it." He held her eyes. "But I wanted you to know that's what I'm thinking about. So you know where I am." She thought about Thomas, who had loved her fully and completely and left a gap that had taken 2 years to stop falling into. She thought about what she had built in that gap. The shop, the case against Voss, the Whitfield arrangement, the version of herself that knew how to carry a thing alone and was now, carefully, learning when not to. She thought about what it meant to let someone know where they stood and what it cost them to say it plainly without maneuvering. "I know where you are," she said. "I need you to know that I'm still figuring out where I am. Not with you specifically, with all of it. Who I am now, what I want, what I'm willing to carry with someone else, and what stays mine." She met his eyes. "That's not a no. It's not a not yet. It's just what's true right now." "That's enough," he said. "Is it?" "Knowing where you actually are is always better than a comfortable answer that isn't true," he said. "I'd rather have the real one." From the barn, Maisie called, "Mama, Franklin wants to see your face." Eliza looked at Caleb. He was looking at her with the slow smile, the real one. "Franklin doesn't have opinions yet," she called back. "He will when he meets you," Maisie called. She walked toward the barn. After a step, she looked back. "Come on," she said. "Come and meet the horse you've apparently owned for 5 minutes." He came. The months after that were not a story with a clean shape. They were months, which meant they had ordinary difficulties and ordinary satisfactions in the irregular proportion that actual life delivers. The trustee took 6 weeks instead of 4 to finalize the Juniper Street transfer, because paperwork moves at its own pace regardless of what anyone wants. And then one of the documents came back with a clerical error that required correction, and then the correction had to be notarized, and by the time it was fully resolved, it was December and Eliza had stopped caring about the timeline and started caring only about the outcome, which was correct. The Whitfield Winter Commission produced 4 designs. 2 were accepted unchanged, 1 was modified in a direction Eliza didn't entirely agree with, and 1 was rejected. She thought about the rejection for 2 days, decided Whitfield was wrong, said so in a letter that was professional and specific, and received a response from Dorothea Whitfield saying she appreciated the pushback and would reconsider, which was not the same as reversing the decision but was something. The working relationship with Whitfield was proving to be what Eliza had suspected. Complicated, worthwhile, and requiring the kind of ongoing negotiation that she had found well suited for. Caleb came to Sunday dinner most weeks, not every week. He had his own life, his own work, the ranch that was still being rebuilt piece by piece, but most. Maisie took his attendance for granted in the easy way of children who have incorporated something into their understanding of how things work. Eliza noticed this and did not say anything about it because it was accurate. He asked before he did things. Now. Not everything. Some things didn't require asking, and she didn't want a man who needed permission to pass the bread. But the larger things, the things that touched her space or her decisions, he checked first. He asked if she wanted him to talk to the new postmaster about the mail route on Juniper Street, which had been unreliable. He asked before he offered to help with the delivery of fabric that she was managing perfectly well, which she declined, and he accepted that without comment. There were still friction points. He had a habit of solving things in his head before presenting them as questions, which meant the question had a preformed answer inside it that she could feel. She said so, twice. Both times he listened. The habit didn't disappear, but it became something they both knew was there, which made it navigable instead of just irritating. She was not easy either. She knew this. She had a way of going silent when she was worried that could read as coldness from the outside. And Caleb had, once, asked her directly if he had done something wrong when the answer was that she was 3 days behind on the Whitfield Commission and couldn't figure out the structural problem with the bodice on sketch 4. She had explained this. He had said, "What's the structural problem?" And they had talked it through at the kitchen table for 40 minutes, him asking questions and her talking through the construction logic, and she had figured out the problem somewhere around the 30-minute mark. And he had understood that he hadn't needed to understand the answer, only needed to ask the right questions to help her reach it herself. She thought about that afterward, about what it meant to be with someone who was useful in the right ways. Not useful in the ways that removed her agency, but useful in the ways that supported what she was already doing. There was a difference, and it was not always a simple one to identify, and she thought most people went their whole lives without finding someone who understood it. In February, on a Sunday evening after dinner, after Maisie had been put to bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table and didn't leave at his usual time. He sat with his empty coffee cup and his hands around it, and Eliza sat across from him with her notebook open to a sketch that she was not looking at. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small piece of cloth, a handkerchief she saw folded into a shape that held something inside it. He set it on the table between them and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a ring. Small, plain, gold, with a very small stone that caught the lamplight once and then sat quietly. It was not extravagant. It was the kind of thing a man gets when he's been rebuilding a ranch for 3 years and has been careful with money and has also thought clearly about what the person he's asking would actually want. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I'm not asking you to change what you've built," he said. "I'm not asking you to move your shop or take my name if you don't want it or stop doing the Whitfield work or stop being who you are. I'm not asking you to need me." He held her eyes. "I'm asking you to choose me. Every day with your eyes open, knowing I'm going to get things wrong sometimes and get them right sometimes and keep asking instead of deciding." A pause. "I want to build whatever comes next with you. From the start. From asking." The lamp was steady. Outside, February had the particular silence of deep cold. Inside, everything was still. She thought about the woman she had been when Thomas died. Gutted, practical, making lists at the kitchen table because lists were what kept her upright. She thought about the woman she had become in 2 years of building something alone. Harder in some places, clearer in others, more certain of what she could carry and what she needed to put down. She thought about what she wanted. She knew what she wanted. "Yes," she said. He breathed out, just once, like something he'd been holding for a long time. She reached across the table and picked up the ring. She looked at it in the lamplight for a moment, its plainness, its correctness, the small stone doing its quiet work. "Maisie made you something," she said. "She doesn't know that's what it was for, but she made it." He looked at her. "She's been working on a piece of cloth for 3 weeks," Eliza said. "She said it was for something important. She didn't know what yet." She felt the corner of her mouth move. "I'll give it to her in the morning to give to you. She'll have opinions about the timing." "She always does," he said. Eliza put the ring on. It fit, which was either luck or a man who paid more attention than he let on. She thought it was probably the latter. She looked across the table at Caleb Thornridge, imperfect, careful, wrong, sometimes and right sometimes, and still learning the difference, which put him in the same category as every worthwhile person she had ever known, including herself. He was looking back at her with the real expression, the one that didn't perform anything. She thought about something she had understood slowly over the months of this particular life she had been building, that the people worth staying near are not the ones who make you smaller in the name of keeping you safe. They are the ones who stand beside what you're building and say, "What can I hold while you work?" That was not a lesson she had learned cleanly or quickly. It had come through loss and reconstruction and a legal fight and a secondhand sewing machine in a room that had to be dismantled and rebuilt correctly. It had come through the small daily choice to keep going, to keep asking, to keep doing the work even when the outcome wasn't certain. She was still learning it. So was he. That was, she thought, the correct way to be. The winter passed. The spring came, as it does, without ceremony or permission. Maisie turned 5 in March and received, among other things, a proper set of fabric shears her own size, which Eliza would come to regret and not regret in approximately equal measure. The Whitfield Spring Commission went better than the winter one, and the rejected design from the first collection was accepted for the second, with modifications that Eliza found acceptable, which was its own kind of progress. The Huang family expanded their laundry to the adjacent space, which the new trustee made available at a fair rate. Ned Coulter printed a small article about the resolved dispute in the Alder Creek paper, and Foss sent her a copy with a note that said simply, "Well done." Margaret Hollis read the article and said nothing about it, which from Margaret was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Harold Voss was not heard from again in Alder Creek. There were 3 chairs at the dinner table on Juniper Street on Sundays, and then in autumn they moved to the ranch 4 miles east, where there was more room and a kitchen that had been worked on through the summer to make it function properly. Planned together, built together, nothing decided without asking. Maisie had a room with a wall for her portfolio, which now included several portraits of Franklin. 2 landscapes of the creek, and an abstract muslin piece that she said represented the future. She still hadn't painted it. She was still working on it. That seemed right to Eliza. The future is something you keep working on rather than something you finish. The idea that what you are building is only ever in progress. That the correct answer to most large questions is not yet. But here is what I'm doing in the meantime. Here is what I chose today. Here is what I will keep choosing. One small, honest choice at a time. She thought about this sometimes in the early mornings, at the kitchen table that was now in a different kitchen than the one where she had started, when the lamp made its warm circle and the house was quiet before anyone else woke up. She thought about Thomas, who had loved her truly and left her with more than she had known at the time. She thought about who she had become in the building and what the building had required. She thought it had required exactly this: not rescue, not completion, not someone to make the hard parts easy. Just the knowledge that someone was standing beside her, asking instead of deciding, learning the same things at the same pace in the same direction. Outside, the season was always doing something, turning, deepening, moving on. Inside, the lamp was steady. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. The wedding was in April, when the mud had mostly dried and the first green was coming up along the creek line. They had planned it small because neither of them wanted something large. The people who mattered were Margaret Hollis, who wore a good dress she had made herself and cried exactly once during the ceremony and denied it afterward. Ned Coulter and his wife, who brought a jar of honey from their own hive and a handshake that lasted too long. The Huang family, who brought food, a genuine amount of food, more than the number of people present could reasonably account for, which turned out not to be a problem because people ate past the point of reason and were glad for it. Dora Satterley, who came quietly and stood in the back and hugged Eliza at the end with the fierce grip of someone who has been scared a long time and is finally not. Foss had been invited and sent a letter of regret and a bottle of good whiskey, which Caleb said was possibly the better gift. Maisie was the one who carried the ring. She had known for 2 days that this was her job, and she had taken it with a seriousness that bordered on the ceremonial. She wore her best dress and her hated hat, which she consented to without argument on this particular occasion, and she walked to the front of the small gathering at the ranch with the ring in her small hands held flat and open, the way Eliza had shown her. The way you carry something that belongs to someone else, and that you have been trusted with. She got there without incident. She held the ring out to Caleb. He took it and looked down at her. "Thank you, Maisie," he said. She looked up at him with the full directness that was her permanent condition. "You're going to be here all the time now," she said. "That's the plan," he said. She thought about this for a moment. "Okay," she said, and she went back to stand beside Margaret, who put a hand on her shoulder and left it there. Eliza watched her daughter from the front of the room and felt something she didn't have a word for. Not in English, not in any language she knew. It was the feeling of understanding suddenly and fully that what you have built is real. That it has weight and texture and a future you can't entirely see yet, and that is the correct way for it to be. She looked at Caleb. He was looking at her. They said the words that needed saying, simple and plain, without performance. He promised what he had already told her he would promise, to ask before deciding, to listen before fixing, to stand beside and not in front. She promised what was true for her, to say the hard things out loud, to let him be useful in the right ways, to choose him again each day with her eyes open. The small gathering clapped. Maisie cheered with a volume that was disproportionate to her size. Margaret stopped denying she was crying and simply looked out the window instead, which was effectively the same thing. The Huang family produced the food, and everyone ate too much, and Ned Coulter told a story about the legal fight that was 70% accurate and 100% satisfying, and Margaret corrected him on the details twice and was right both times, and Dora Satterley laughed for the first time in months and looked almost surprised by the sound of it. Maisie fell asleep in the corner chair, a different chair in a different house, but the same basic physics of childhood, the same sudden and total surrender to sleep wherever she happened to land, with her hat still on and one hand still loosely curled around a piece of wedding cake she had not finished. Caleb carried her to her room. He came back and stood in the doorway of the front room, where the remaining guests were still talking, and he looked at Eliza across the room, and she looked back, and something passed between them that required no words and no ceremony. Just, "You are here, I am here," that is the whole of it. After the guests went home, they sat together in the kitchen in the quiet that came after people leave. A full quiet, warm rather than empty. The kind that contains an evening rather than just the absence of noise. The lamp burned low. The dishes were half done and neither of them moved to finish them. "It was a good day," Caleb said. "It was," Eliza said. Maisie ate approximately her weight in cake. "She'll be difficult tomorrow." "She'll be fine," he said. "She's resilient." "She gets that from Thomas," Eliza said. And then, because she had learned by now that the truth was better than the comfortable elision, "She gets it from both of us." Caleb looked at her across the table. "Yeah," he said, "she does." She reached across and put her hand on his, flat and certain, the way she had done months ago in the shop to stop his hat turning. The gesture that had meant, "Stop moving, be here, I am here too." He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that for a while. Outside, the April night was mild, and the creek could be heard if you were quiet enough to listen for it. Inside, the lamp made its circle, and the house held its new shape around them. Not finished, never finished, always a work in progress. And Eliza thought about everything that had brought her to this kitchen, to this table, to this specific moment. She thought about choices, the small ones mostly, because that's what a life is really made of. Not the dramatic turning points, but the daily decisions, the ones that barely feel like decisions when you're making them. The decision to post a letter to a lawyer in Crayston. The decision to walk across town with Maisie on her hip instead of sending a polite refusal. The decision to say the hard thing out loud in a room where a sewing table had been built without her consent. The decision to say yes to a ring on a February evening when the lamp was steady and the answer was already there before he finished asking. None of those had felt like fate or grand design. They had felt like choices, imperfect, uncertain, made with incomplete information the way all real choices are made. And they had accumulated slowly into a life she recognized as hers. She thought about what she would tell Maisie someday, when Maisie was old enough to ask the right questions. Not the easy version of the story, not the version where love arrives like a resolution to everything that came before it, the real version. That you don't get rescued from grief or hardship by finding the right person. You carry those things yourself, through time, through work, through the daily choice to keep building. And if you're careful and a little lucky and honest enough with yourself to know what you actually want rather than what looks right on paper, you might find someone who understands the difference between standing beside you and standing in front of you. Someone who asks instead of decides. Someone who learns as you learn what it means to build something together without losing what either of you built alone. That's not a small thing to find. It's not a guaranteed thing. It's what she had found imperfectly and gradually and through more difficulty than she would have chosen. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole thing, actually. She looked at the lamp, she looked at their hands on the table, she looked at the doorway where, behind it, her daughter was sleeping with her hat still on. "We should check on her," she said. "She's fine," he said. "She's always fine." "The hat," Eliza said. He smiled. "I'll get the hat." He went and came back with the hat and set it on the counter, and they both knew that Maisie would wake in the morning and ask immediately where the hat was, and be unreasonably pleased to find it waiting for her, because that was who she was. A child who needed things to be where she left them, who needed to know that the people she trusted were where she expected them. They would be. That was the promise, not in the vows, but underneath them. To be where they said they would be, to show up in the ordinary ways that ordinary days required, to make the small choices every morning that added up to the large one they had already made. The lamp burned steady. The creek ran along the south edge of the land. Franklin the horse slept in the barn with the specific placidity of a creature who has accepted his situation completely. And in the kitchen of the ranch 4 miles east of Alder Creek, 2 people sat at a table with their hands together, not saying much because there was nothing left to say that the evening hadn't already said for them. The season was turning as it always did. The work would be there in the morning. So would they.